"Stop, don't scream, just get in." The mafia boss saved a bride from her own wedding, not knowing she was the girl who saved his life 10 years ago. The first time he saw her in that white lace dress, Sanction felt only the mission, because he did not know the woman he was kidnapping was the only woman he had ever loved. Sanction was lean, he was dangerous, he was feared. His tattoos told stories of wars he had won and enemies he had buried. His car was black and fast, a red-lined sanctuary on wheels. His suits were sharp, his blade was sharper. Everything in his life was under his command. Everything except his memories. After a cold morning of making deals that shook the city's underground, Sanction felt a pull he couldn't explain. He told his men to intercept the wedding motorcade. He wanted justice. He opened the door. The morning was cold, but the silk of the wedding gown felt like ice against Asha's skin. She stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, a vision of pearl and lace, yet her reflection looked like a stranger trapped in a glass coffin. Outside the window, the city of souls stretched out, indifferent to the woman whose life was being signed away in a contract disguised as a marriage certificate. Asha reached for the bouquet of white roses on the vanity. She clutched them so tightly, the stems threatened to bruise her palms. They were her lifeline, the only thing keeping her grounded as the heavy oak doors of her suite creaked open. Kojo stepped in, his presence filling the room with a suffocating weight. He was the picture of social power, tall, broad-shouldered, and draped in a tuxedo that cost more than the dreams Asha had been forced to abandon. He didn't look at her with love. He looked at her with the calculating eye of a man inspecting a new acquisition. He walked behind her, his large hands resting on her shoulders, his gaze meeting hers in the mirror. "Everything is ready, Asha," he whispered, his voice as sharp and cold as a winter wind. "The cameras are waiting, the world is watching. Do not forget who gave you this life." Asha said nothing, she couldn't. Her voice had been buried under years of expectations and debts. She simply pressed her finger to her lips, a habit of a woman who lived on secrets. Kojo mistook the gesture for bridal modesty and smirked, satisfied with her silence. The walk to the motorcade felt like a march to a beautiful execution. The hallway was lined with security, men with dead eyes who moved like shadows. Asha felt the stares of the staff, their pity hidden behind practiced professional smiles. As she stepped out into the crisp morning air, the flash of cameras blinded her. A long line of black cars waited, a velvet-lined cage ready to transport her to the altar. As the car door opened, Asha looked at the white roses in her lap. She thought of a boy she had known a lifetime ago, a boy with no name and hungry eyes, to whom she had once promised her heart in a world far removed from this luxury. She wondered if he was still out there, or if the city had swallowed him whole. "Move," Kojo commanded gently, though the threat was clear in his tight jaw. Asha stepped into the vehicle, the scent of expensive leather and heavy cologne filling her senses. The motorcade began to move, a slow, solemn procession through the heart of the city. She watched the world pass by through the tinted glass, praying for a miracle, not knowing that a few blocks away, a man in a charcoal suit was already checking his watch, ready to break the world to find her. The intersection was a blur of screeching tires and sudden stillness. Before the wedding motorcade could reach the cathedral, a single black sedan cut through the procession with surgical precision. The door swung open like an invitation to another world. Asha didn't hesitate. She stepped out of the white silk of her bridal car and into the deep, crimson shadows of the stranger's vehicle. The interior was a red sanctuary, smelling of aged cedar and expensive tobacco. Asha sank into the plush leather, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Beside her sat Sanction. He didn't look at her immediately. He sat with a lean, dangerous composure, one tattooed hand draped over the steering wheel, the other resting near the gear shift. His charcoal suit was sharp, but it was the quiet power radiating from him that commanded the air. Outside the reinforced glass, the world was descending into chaos. Kojo had lunged from his lead vehicle, his broad shoulders casting a massive shadow over the car door. His face was a mask of calculated fury, his jaw tight as he stared through the window. He pounded a heavy fist against the glass, a silent demand for his property to be returned. To anyone else, Kojo was the pinnacle of authority, a man who owned the city's skyline. To Sanction, he was merely an obstacle in the rearview mirror. Asha looked at the man beside her, then back at the man screaming silently outside. She raised a trembling hand and pressed a single finger to her lips. It was a signal, a secret shared between two people in a world that allowed them none. Sanction's eyes finally shifted. They were cold, unreadable depths. But as they landed on Asha, on the way she clutched her white roses even now, something flickered behind the frost. He didn't know why this bride felt like a haunting melody. He had forgotten the lyrics too. He only knew that Kojo would never touch her again. "Stay low," Sangchun said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that cut through the muffled thuds of Kojo's rage. Kojo's fingers gripped the door handle, pulling with a strength that suggested he would tear the metal from its hinges. His eyes met Asha's through the tint, promising a high price for this humiliation. But Sangchun simply shifted the car into gear. With a calm flick of his tattooed wrist, he pulled away from the curb, leaving the groom standing in the middle of the street. A fading figure of a life Asha was no longer required to lead. As the car accelerated into the heart of the city, the red sanctuary grew quiet. The tension remained, thick and heavy, but for the first time in years, the air Asha breathed didn't feel like a debt. The red sanctuary of the car sped through the city's concrete veins, the neon lights of Seoul bleeding across the dashboard, in rhythmic pulses of violet and gold. Sangchun's hands were steady on the wheel, his tattooed knuckles pale against the dark leather. He was a man who lived by the logic of shadows and silver. Yet the woman sitting inches away from him was a variable he hadn't accounted for. She wasn't crying, she wasn't screaming. She was simply there, a ghost in white lace. Asha finally turned her head. Her dark skin was luminous in the shifting light, her braided hair still perfectly adorned with pearls that mocked the chaos they had left behind. She didn't ask where they were going or if she was safe. Instead, she looked at him, really looked at him, with an intensity that made the air in the cabin feel thin. It was in that look that the world tilted. Sangchun glanced toward her, intending to offer a cold reassurance, but the words died in his throat. He saw it then, the way her eyes held a mixture of desperation and a secret, ancient longing. It was a gaze that spoke 1,000 words without a single sound. It was the volume in a glance he had only encountered once before. In a lifetime, he had tried to bury under charcoal suits and iron-fisted rule. A sudden, sharp memory pierced his composure. He saw a dusty alleyway, smelled the scent of rain on hot pavement, and felt the small, warm hand of a girl who had shared her last piece of bread with a starving boy. That girl had looked at him exactly like this, as if she could see the soul he didn't know he possessed. "Who are you?" Asha's voice finally broke the silence. It was soft, but it carried the weight of a mountain. Sangchun didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. His heart, a vault he had kept locked for a decade, suffered a hairline fracture. He looked at her fingers, still clutching the white roses, and then at his own tattooed hands. He had built an empire to ensure he would never be helpless again, never realizing that the very person he was building it for had been drifting through the same city, trapped in a different kind of cage. The realization didn't come with a roar. It came with a devastating, quiet clarity. He hadn't just intercepted a rival's bride. He had found the only anchor his life had ever known. He felt a phantom ache in his chest, a ghost waking up after a 10-year sleep, someone who doesn't believe in debts. He finally replied, his voice a low rasp that vibrated with a hidden truth. "But someone who remembers a promise." Asha's breath hitched. She looked at the tattoos crawling up his neck, symbols of a man who had become a monster to survive. Yet in the curve of his jaw, she saw the shadow of the boy who had once promised to come back for her. The silence between them changed then. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the heavy, charged quiet of two souls recognizing each other across a vast, bloody canyon of time. The rain in the slums did not wash the streets. It only turned the dust into a thick, clinging grief. 10 years ago, the world was not made of charcoal suits and red leather. It was made of rusted corrugated metal and the sharp, persistent ache of hunger. Sangchun had been a boy with no name and ribs that counted themselves against his skin. He had collapsed against a damp brick wall, his eyes glazed with the exhaustion of a child who had already seen too much of the world's teeth. Then there was Asha. She hadn't been wearing white lace then. She wore a faded cotton dress that had seen too many washings, her hair braided tight by a mother who worked 3 jobs. She was the only one who didn't walk past the shivering boy in the shadows. She had knelt in the mud, her silk-dark skin glowing against the gray gloom of the alley. In her small, steady hands, she held a single piece of bread, split unevenly so that the larger half was pressed into his palms. "Eat," she had whispered. Her voice even then held that quiet authority, a volume that transcended the noise of the surrounding poverty. Sangchun had looked up at her, his vision blurring. He was a creature of the streets, used to stones and cold shoulders, but she had looked at him as if he were a king in rags. She stayed with him as the sun dipped below the jagged skyline, shielding him from the wind with her own small frame. "When I grow up," Sanchin had rasped, his voice cracking with a resolve that shouldn't have belonged to a starving child. "I will build a wall so high that the wind can never touch you again. I will find you, and I will make sure you never have to share your bread because you'll have everything." Asha had smiled then, a sad, beautiful curve of her lips, and pressed her finger to them. "SHH," she'd murmured, "just survive. That's the only promise I want." She had given him a small, worn trinket that day, a simple wooden bead on a string, and he had clutched it like a holy relic as the authorities eventually separated them, pulling them into different corners of a harsh city. The memory surged back into the present-day car, hitting Sanchin with the force of a physical blow. He glanced at the woman beside him, her silhouette framed by the expensive neon of the city he now commanded. He had kept his word, he had built the walls, he had acquired the everything he promised. But in the process of becoming the man who could protect her, he had become a man she could no longer recognize. Asha looked down at her hands, still trembling. She didn't know yet that the charcoal-suited monster beside her was the boy from the mud. But the way he gripped the steering wheel, white-knuckled and desperate, echoed a ghost she had carried in her heart for a decade. The city changed. The neon lights that had once seemed like beacons of freedom now felt like thousands of eyes watching for a flicker of white lace. Kojo's reach was not just in the muscles of his back or the sharpness of his tuxedo. It was in the airwaves, the fiber-optic cables, and the bank accounts of every man in the province. Within minutes of the car pulling away, the digital world began to scream. Sanchin watched his dashboard. A series of encrypted alerts flashed across the screen, red icons, signaling that his personal accounts had been frozen with a single high-level command. Kojo wasn't just a groom. He was a titan of industry with the power to turn a man into a ghost. He had used his influence to frame the rescue as a violent kidnapping, putting a bounty on Sanchin's head that made every street corner a potential trap. Outside the tinted windows, the high-stakes pursuit intensified. Black SUVs with reinforced bumpers began to weave through the evening traffic, their movements coordinated with military precision. They weren't police, they were Kojo's private security, men who operated in the gray areas of the law. They didn't need sirens to announce their arrival. They simply occupied the space behind Sanchin's sedan, a growing shadow that refused to be shaken. Asha watched the rearview mirror, her breath hitching as she saw the familiar grille of Kojo's favorite vehicle looming closer. "He won't stop," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He doesn't care about the wedding anymore. He only cares about the humiliation. To him, I am a debt that hasn't been paid." Sanchin didn't flinch. He navigated the narrow backstreets with a calm that bordered on the supernatural, his tattooed hands moving in a blurred dance of iron-willed control. He knew Kojo's play, to squeeze him until he had nowhere to run, to isolate him from his resources until he was forced to surrender the prize. "Let him hunt," Sanchin said, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "He thinks he's chasing a thief. He doesn't realize he's chasing a man who has already lived through the end of the world." The car dove into a subterranean parking complex, the screech of tires echoing against the concrete pillars. The shadows here were thick and cold, providing a momentary reprieve from the digital eyes above. Sanchin killed the lights, plunging the red sanctuary into darkness. They sat in the silence, the only sound the ticking of the cooling engine and the distant, rhythmic thud of Kojo's men searching the streets above. In the dark, Asha felt a hand reach out, not to grab her, but to steady her. For a fleeting second, the cold mafia boss disappeared, replaced by the weight of a silent promise that had survived 10 years of winter. The safe house was a skeletal remains of an old textile factory, hidden behind layers of rusted iron and the humming silence of the industrial district. Inside, the air smelled of cold dust and old rain, a stark departure from the floral perfume of the wedding car. Sanchin moved through the shadows with the practiced ease of a predator returning to its den, his charcoal suit jacket finally discarded on a wooden crate. As the adrenaline of the chase ebbed, the physical toll became visible. A dark stain had begun to bloom across the white cotton of his dress shirt. Just beneath his ribs, a jagged souvenir from a shard of glass during the interception. He didn't wince, but his breath was hitching, a rhythmic hitch that betrayed the iron composure of his face. "Sit," Asha commanded. It wasn't a request. The quiet grace she had carried all morning had sharpened into something resilient. She dropped her bouquet of white roses onto a dusty table and reached for a first aid kit tucked into a wall niche. Sanchin sat, his back against a cold concrete pillar. As Asha knelt before him, her white lace gown pooling in the dirt like a fallen cloud, she began to unbutton his shirt. Her fingers were steady, but her heart hammered against her chest. As the fabric fell away, she didn't just see the wound. She saw the map of his life. Tattoos crawled up his torso, intricate and dark, but her breath caught when her eyes landed on his inner forearm. There, amidst the heavy ink of dragons and thorns, was a small, delicate design that didn't fit the rest. It was a simple, hand-drawn sketch of a wooden bead on a string, the very trinket she had given a starving boy 10 years ago. Asha's hand drifted toward the ink, her fingertips hovering just above his skin. "You kept it," she whispered, her voice fracturing. "All this time, you were building a kingdom out of shadows, but you kept a drawing of a piece of wood." Sanchin looked down at her, his unreadable eyes finally softening into something raw and vulnerable. The mafia boss was gone. In his place was the boy who had once promised to build a wall against the wind. He didn't pull away. Instead, he reached out, his tattooed hand gently tucking a stray braid behind her ear. "The walls were for you, Asha." He rasped, the words heavy with a decade of unspoken longing. "Everything I took, everything I became. It was so I would never have to be the boy who couldn't protect you again. I didn't know the man you were marrying was the one I was fighting. I only knew that I saw a girl in a white dress who looked like she was drowning, and I couldn't let go twice." Asha began to clean the wound, her movements rhythmic and tender. The silence between them was no longer filled with the noise of Kojo's pursuit. It was filled with the realization that their souls had never truly been apart. But as she stitched the skin of the most feared man in the city, she knew the peace was temporary. Kojo was still out there, and he didn't just want his bride. He wanted to erase the man who had dared to remind her who she truly was. The peace of the old factory was shattered not by a sound, but by the sudden, oppressive weight of headlights cutting through the dust-choked windows. The high beams of Kojo's lead vehicle washed over the concrete pillars, turning the white lace of Asha's gown into a glowing target. Kojo didn't arrive with the chaos of a street brawler. He arrived with the cold, rhythmic clicking of polished shoes against the factory floor. He stepped into the light, his black tuxedo unrumpled, his jaw set in a line of absolute, calculated authority. Behind him, a wall of men stood in the shadows, but Kojo raised a single hand to stay them. He didn't want a riot, he wanted a surrender. He looked at Asha, his eyes narrow and dark with the sting of a public humiliation he intended to rectify with a private ending. "Asha," Kojo's voice resonated through the hollow space, steady and terrifyingly calm. "You've had your moment of rebellion. Now, step away from the ghost in the charcoal suit. He has nothing left to offer you but a grave in a forgotten warehouse." Sanchin stood slowly, his wound was fresh, the white bandage beneath his shirt already blooming with a small, crimson reminder of his mortality. He didn't reach for the weapon tucked into his waistband. He didn't signal for the hidden backup that usually followed a man of his status. Instead, he stepped in front of Asha, his lean frame a shield between her and the man who saw her as a trophy. "He's right about one thing," Sanchin said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried no fear. "I am a ghost. I died 10 years ago in an alleyway, and the only thing that brought me back was the memory of a girl who gave a starving boy a reason to survive." He looked back at Asha, his unreadable eyes finally clear. For a decade, he had led with the brutality of a boss, believing that power was the only language the world understood. But as he faced Kojo, he realized that power was just another cage. To save her, he had to stop being the monster Kojo expected and start being the man he had promised to become. Sanchin turned back to Kojo and spread his hands wide, palms open, a gesture of ultimate vulnerability. "You want the girl, you have to understand something first. She was never yours to take. She belongs to the promises we kept when we had nothing. You have the city, Kojo, you have the money, but you will never have the look she gives a man who actually knows her name." The air in the factory grew thin. Kojo's hand tightened into a fist, his composure finally fracturing at the realization that no amount of social power could buy the loyalty he saw in Asha's eyes. As Kojo took a step forward, his shadow looming large, Sanchin didn't flinch. He stood his ground not as a king of the underground, but as a protector keeping a 10-year-old vow, ready to endure whatever came next to ensure the wind never touched her again. The heavy air of the textile factory seemed to vibrate with the hum of Kojo's idling engines outside. Kojo's face was a mask of aristocratic fury, his eyes darting between the man in the blood-stained charcoal suit and the woman who had once been his crowning achievement. He stepped forward, the light catching the gold watch on his wrist, a symbol of the time and money he believed could buy any soul. "You speak of promises like a poet." "Sanction," Kojo sneered, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low frequency, "but promises don't stop bullets, and they don't buy silence. You are a criminal. I am the law of the city, Asha. Come to me now, and I will tell the press you were confused. I will forget this afternoon ever happened." Asha felt the weight of Sanction's presence in front of her. He was lean, wounded, and outnumbered, yet he stood like a mountain. She looked at the white lace of her sleeves, then at the dirt on the floor, and finally at the man who thought he owned her. The quiet girl who communicated in glances was gone. She stepped out from behind Sanction's shoulder. Her movements were fluid, her chin lifted with a grace that Kojo had never been able to manufacture. She didn't look at Kojo with fear. She looked at him with the cold clarity of someone who had finally seen the bottom of a shallow well. "You didn't want a wife, Kojo," Asha said, her voice ringing through the hollow rafters. "You wanted a mirror to reflect your own power. You wanted a trophy to sit at your table, while you signed away the lives of people who live in the slums we came from." From the folds of her lace gown, Asha pulled a small, silver drive, the one thing she had managed to snatch from Kojo's study the night before the wedding. It contained the digital ledger of his illegal land seizures, the very documents he used to crush the neighborhoods of the poor to build his glittering towers. "The world is watching, Kojo," she continued, her finger hovering over a button on her phone that linked to the drive. "But they aren't watching a wedding. They are watching a confession." Kojo's face went pale. The calculated authority he wore like a suit began to fray at the edges. He looked at his men, then back at the woman he had underestimated. He had seen her as a prize to be won, never realizing she was the one who held the keys to his kingdom. Sanction watched her, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He had spent 10 years learning how to be a monster to protect her. But here she was, destroying a titan with nothing but the truth. He reached out, his tattooed hand finding hers, their fingers interlocking between the lace and the charcoal. "The veil is lifted," Sanction murmured, his voice a steady anchor in the shifting tide. "You aren't a bride anymore, Asha. You're free." Kojo took a faltering step back as the distant sound of sirens, real sirens, not his private security, began to wail in the distance. The digital empire he had built was beginning to dissolve, one line of code at a time. The morning sun rose over a different kind of horizon, one where the light didn't have to fight through the smog of the industrial district or the tinted windows of a getaway car. The air here was salt-thick and sweet, carrying the scent of wild citrus and the rhythmic, grounding pulse of the tide. In this small coastal village, far from the neon reach of Seoul and the shattered remains of Kojo's empire, the silence was finally a choice rather than a survival tactic. Sanction stood on the wooden porch of a modest whitewashed cottage. He had shed the charcoal suits and the heavy weight of the mafia's iron-fisted expectations. Now he wore a simple linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the tattoos that had once been his armor. They were no longer declarations of war. They were merely memories etched in ink. He watched the waves, his lean frame relaxed in a way it had never been during his years of building walls against the wind. Asha stepped out to join him, her feet bare against the sun-warmed wood. She was no longer draped in suffocating white lace or burdened by the pearl pins that had felt like thorns. She wore a simple yellow sundress that caught the breeze, her dark skin radiant in the natural light. She didn't carry a bouquet of roses like a shield anymore. Instead, she carried 2 mugs of tea, the steam curling into the morning air. She handed one to him, her fingers brushing against his tattooed knuckles. There was no flinch, no secret glance, and no finger pressed to her lips. The secrets were gone, replaced by a transparency that made the world feel wide and reachable. "Is it enough?" Sanction asked, his voice losing its raspy edge of danger, softening into something warm and human. He looked at the small garden they had started, the patch of earth where things grew because they were nurtured, not because they were commanded. Asha leaned her head against his shoulder, looking out at the endless blue of the sea. "It's everything," she whispered. They had spent a lifetime chasing power and safety, believing that the only way to survive was to become unassailable. But as they sat together, in the quiet hum of a normal morning, they realized that true strength wasn't in the size of a kingdom or the weight of a name. It was in the ability to wake up without fear, to share a meal without a debt, and to look at the person beside you and see the child who had once promised to stay. Sanction set his mug down and took her hand, his thumb tracing the palm that had once held a split piece of bread for a starving boy. He had kept his promise. He had built a life where the wind couldn't touch her. But it wasn't made of high walls or charcoal suits. It was made of this, the simple, beautiful rhythm of a life lived for no one but themselves. In the quiet of the coast, they finally understood that normal wasn't boring. Normal was a miracle. The war is over. The silence is finally theirs. Because when two worlds collide with this much grit, even a mafia boss knows that normal is the greatest miracle of all. Love the journey. Subscribe to join the AfroKorean Grit community. Like this video to help us grow. And tell us, would you have stepped into the car? Until next.